Welcome back, FBC family. Today we have a very special episode of FBC Extra. We are talking with one of our members, Dr. Joe Martins. He is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Professor of Law, and Director of Constitutional Litigation Clinic at Liberty University. He brings a ton of experience in the field of civil procedure, foundations of law, jurisprudence, and constitutional litigation clinic. And today we are going to discuss the latest ruling from the Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade and how we should move forward as a church and as believers. Let's get started.
One of the things that I really love about Forest Baptist Church is our membership. We have people from all different walks of life who have all different sorts of experience and bring a lot of wisdom to the table. Well, one of those people you've heard from recently in a word from the pastor on the Roe v. Wade topic was Joe Martins. He is a dean at LU in the law department. He has a ton of law background. He knows the ins and outs, and we're thankful that he is here today to help break down the Roe v. Wade decision, what that means for us. And Joe, we're so thankful you're here, man. Before we really dive in, though, let's hear a little bit about you. Where do you come from? Let's hear a little bit about Joe Martins.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I was born and raised in Virginia, grew up in Northern Virginia. About 10 years ago, moved from the Nashville area to Lynchburg, Virginia, to work at Liberty University School of Law. And I teach there. I teach classes related to biblical law and constitutional law. And before I came to Liberty, I actually worked with organizations that defended the First Amendment rights of people to speak their faith, to live their faith out. And so this is an area, particularly the area of life, has been an area that's been a passion of mine to protect and defend for many years. And I get to basically train up the next generation of lawyers at Liberty University and just love what I get to do.
What is your official role at Liberty?
I am a professor of law and I am the associate dean for academic affairs.
So let's start here. Does the Bible specifically say that abortion is wrong? I mean, obviously, if our defense is from a biblical worldview, we have to have God is anti-abortion. Is God anti-abortion?
Of course he is. I think the question that you asked is a really good one, though, because if you open your Bible software app and you do a search for abortion, you say, where is the Bible verse that says thou shalt not commit an abortion? You're not going to find that word abortion in there. But God is clearly pro-life. In fact, that's the foundation for our stance as a church to defend life, is because we are following God's lead. God made us in his image. Human life is different than any other life. You see that in just starting from Genesis 1. That's the foundation for what we call the sanctity of human life, is that we, unlike any other creation, was made in God's image. We're the only ones that had the breath of God in our lungs. We're the ones that when God created, he said it was very good. So God just stamps that on us at the very, very beginning. And then obviously, many folks are familiar with Psalm 139, where David says through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." So you start off with Genesis, and then you look at Psalm 139, and there are other passages where it's clear that life is sacred from the very, very beginning, even in the womb of our mother.
So we have that. As a country, America, before Roe v. Wade in 1973, do you know what the mantra was before that time period? What was the mindset before the law came into effect?
Well, it's interesting because Roe versus Wade, if you read the Roe versus Wade opinion and you read the Dobbs decision, you will see there's a history lesson to be learned. In Roe versus Wade, the court essentially said, hey, we're looking back at a lot of old statutes and common law in England and in America. We seem to see this distinction where abortion is outlawed or illegal or punished in different ways, but there is this distinction that the court noted in quickening, the idea of when a woman can first feel, the child in her womb. And so the court used that in Roe versus Wade to basically say, it made these two critical distinctions. It said, well, first, the fetus inside a mother's womb is not a person. And second of all, we know that there's potential life there. So viability is going to be the point where the state can step in and protect that potential life. But before that, the woman has this right to abortion. And the court basically said, because when we look back, we don't see a lot of laws addressing this pre-quickening fetus. But there's a reason for that, right? Scientifically, we didn't know what was going on in the womb in the 1600s and 1700s, right? So what you see the law did, and the Supreme Court in Roe cherry-picked its law. As you get further and further from the 18th century, 19th century, and then up to like the 1950s, you see America's laws get stricter and stricter. They basically are more protective over the womb and punish abortion, because as the science realized, whoa, we're able to look into the womb and realize that there is more going on here even before quickening. But the Supreme Court basically tried to cherry pick its laws and say, well, since we don't see a lot of laws explicitly outlawing pre-quickening abortions, we're going to take that to mean a woman had a constitutional right to have an abortion, and so we're going to put that in our Constitution.
So when you look at the Constitution, abortion doesn't fit under constitutional right, correct?
Yeah, but there's something our listeners really need to know. I think sometimes, particularly as conservatives, we may say, well, if it's not in the Constitution, then it's not there, right? We have to be careful with that, because the 9th and 10th Amendments, in the Bill of Rights, specifically say that all of the rights of people haven't been outlined. So what the court has said is some of those non-enumerated rights, we find those by looking at to see if they're deeply rooted in our history and tradition. And that's where the Roe court got it wrong, is they looked back and said, oh, we think that this right to abortion was deeply rooted in our history and tradition. But here's a fact. Here's a stat that your listeners will want to know. The Justice Rehnquist, when he dissented in one of these abortion decisions, he basically pointed out this. He said at the time the 14th Amendment was passed, that's the amendment the Supreme Court in Roe said, this is where we find the liberty, this right to privacy for a woman to have an abortion. So often the court will look back to when was this amendment passed and what was the state of the law at that time. Justice Rehnquist said in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, 28 of the then 37 states and 8 territories had statutes banning or limiting abortion. So the vast majority of states and would-be states, so territories that would become states, banned or limited abortion. But the Roe court overlooked that because they wanted to find this right in the Constitution, which just isn't there.
So abortion talks don't begin with Roe v. Wade. There's some of that hundreds of years earlier in the 1800s and so on. So that's not a relatively new topic.
Yeah, of course. I mean, abortion is something women have been getting pregnant for a long time,
That's
right?
True.
And sadly, people have not respected God's design for children. We know that children are a blessing, but sadly throughout history, cultures have not seen children as a blessing and have tried to find ways to eliminate that. So abortion has been there, but like I was saying earlier, in early British law and American law, the laws were primarily focused on quickening because we just didn't know what was happening before the baby started moving in the womb.
That ruling comes down. What follows it? Like what specifically follows it right after? Like how does the landscape change from that decision?
In Roe, you have for the very first time the Supreme Court saying that there is this constitutional right for women to have abortions. And what that basically means is when the court says that there's a constitutional right to do something, the states can't regulate that, or they have very limited authority to regulate. So any state after Roe that said we want to ban abortion couldn't do that because the Supreme Court said no.
Okay.
Well, then you fast forward to the 1990s, and you may recall Ronald Reagan had said one of his platforms was he was going to try to appoint justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade. So this big case came before the Supreme Court called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Everybody thought the Supreme Court was going to overturn Roe versus Wade. And in fact, the rumor is that there were 5 votes to overturn Roe, and one of the conservatives switched.
Really?
They switched. So it was
wow.
So there was a majority opinion being written in the 1990s to overturn Roe v. Wade,
wow.
And then one of the justices switched. So it became a 5-4 decision to uphold Roe versus Wade. And so Roe versus Wade lived to see another day.
Wow.
And it was able to continue. And in that case, the court added something, though. They basically added this term that your listeners are going to want to. They said the constitutional right to abortion prohibits the states from putting, quote, an undue burden on a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy.
Okay.
So I'd like to ask you, Matt, what is an undue burden?
I don't know. I was going to ask you that very question.
I'm glad you said that, because no one really knows.
And they never defined it.
They never really defined it.
Wow.
So states have tried to say, well, the court seems to say there is some potential life there that we can protect, but we can't put an undue burden in front of a woman who might want to seek an abortion. And so the courts have been back and forth. They'll strike down one law that the court says, well, this is an undue burden on a woman, and then they'll sustain another law that you're like, well, I don't understand the difference between the two. So basically, this undue burden line was very arbitrary and would come to results that were hard to justify. And that was part of the grounds in the Dobbs decision. Justice Alito wrote, he said, look, this line of an undue burden, we don't even know how to apply our own test. And then furthermore, this viability line that the court said in Roe, that basically a woman has a right to an abortion pre-viability. So post-viability, the state could actually start to do more to protect the unborn child. The justices in Dobbs, the majority decision, said that too is an arbitrary line. Because if this is a human life, what makes it any less of a human life the day before viability, or the day before that, or the day before that, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I feel like I'm looking over my shoulder, because it feels like in today's climate, where it feels like we want to push all these different agendas and this woke culture and all these different things. And I was talking to Tim Helm last week about how do we navigate media when they're starting to shove more lesbian and gay and transgender, and we're fighting for all these different things. Then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, we're gonna annul Roe v. Wade. That feels like a little bit of out of left field with our current climate. So I guess it feels somewhat out of place, where we're trying to push the boundaries of God's design out further, and then all of a sudden we bring them back in. What has happened that's caused that to happen?
Matt, nothing but the grace of God. I mean, you are absolutely correct. This feels so countercultural.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that just because Dobbs was handed down, that suddenly America is pro-life from sea to shining sea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing Christians need to understand is first, let's start first and just rejoice. This is a moment to pause and rejoice and say, but by the grace of God.
Absolutely.
There's no chance this would have happened. Let's just be frank right here. Mm-hmm. If Hillary Clinton had won the election, the 2016 election,
right,
that law would have been struck down.
Okay.
So it is by the grace of God that someone appointed conservatives to the bench. And then also the pressure on those folks, when the Dobbs decision was leaked, the pressure on Kavanaugh and Barrett and Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas to change just one of them to flip. Yeah. Roe v. Wade would not have been overturned, and they all stuck the course. That was the grace of God.
Okay, we go from that. What has happened the last 6 months that also helped lead to what we've seen recently? Was there anything else that sort of played behind the scenes for that decision?
Well, one thing that also the unsung heroes of this decision are the crisis pregnancy centers.
Yeah.
The churches, the sidewalk counselors, those that go to abortion clinics and try to, lovingly counsel women not to have an abortion. The people that work at crisis pregnancy centers to try to give women all the support they can to help them to deliver their children in a safe, healthy environment. Those are a lot of the real heroes. But we got to add to that expanded list the various state legislators. The ones who said, you know what? Just think about this. Mississippi. The legislators there were some gutsy legislators who said, I recognize that the state of the law right now is such that the law that I'm proposing will likely be declared unconstitutional. But we're going to propose it anyways because we think that is worth protecting innocent human life. So somebody proposed a bill in the Mississippi legislature, and it got through the committees, and a bunch of brave legislators voted for it. even though it might have been struck down and a brave governor signed onto it and they said they were going to enforce it, even if it got struck down and it worked its way up through the courts and all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that basically served on a platter the opportunity for the Supreme Court to issue its Dobbs decision and not only uphold Mississippi's, what they have was a ban on abortions after 15 weeks. I mean, that basically set the table for the Dobbs decision. And the court said, look, this statute is constitutional. The state of Mississippi has the authority to ban abortions after 15 weeks. And frankly, we think Roe versus Wade was, quote, egregiously wrong. And so we are no longer recognizing a constitutional right for women to terminate their pregnancies. So we are sending this back to the states to regulate.
Post-decision, is that what that looks like now? It's basically the states get to choose one way or the other. It's back in their hands?
Yes, it is. Basically, the issue has been placed back on the ballot box. Okay, so before Roe v. Wade, you might have voted for a representative who said he was pro-life, he or she was pro-life, but there really wasn't a lot they could do about it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Roe versus Wade if it's in the Constitution, that means it's a higher authority than a state law.
Right.
All right. But now, when your legislator in your district says, hey, if you send me to Richmond, I'm going to sign on to Youngkin's, Youngkin is proposing, I believe, a 15-week abortion ban right now.
Okay.
So at the next election, if someone from the House of Delegates in your district says, hey, I'm pro-life and I'm going to support that ban, when you vote for that person now, it actually does something. It can actually change what the laws are in Virginia.
Yeah.
And now if somebody tries to sue and challenge those laws, the Supreme Court's going to say, hey, there's no longer a right to terminate a pregnancy. We gave this back to the people and their elected representatives to legislate and to regulate this issue.
So what happens, do you think, state to state? Do you think it's going to be kind of split on which state? Because obviously some states lean one direction and some lean the other. I mean, we could mention some states that we know are probably going to keep that. But do you think it's going to be kind of split, or how do you think that's going to work?
That's exactly the way it's going to play out. Okay. You're going to have some states probably in the Northeast and the Northwest. There are going to be legislatures that have already, in fact, some have already done it, that have passed laws, and they're going to pass laws that are going to codify a state right to abortion, right? And some states will be very, very liberal, maybe up until, the actual birthday, where up until, right before birth, where you could, through all 3 trimesters, where you could terminate the pregnancy. Other states have had trigger laws. You may have heard that term. There are some states that even before Roe v. Wade was overturned in the Dobbs decision, their legislatures already passed laws that said, as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, if it's ever overturned, in our state, abortion is now illegal.
And those have already gone out.
Yeah. Louisiana has one. Texas has one. There was a third state I'm forgetting right now that had one, that had these trigger laws. So there are states that right now are pushing legislation. Yeah. I think Oklahoma is looking to ban abortion almost all the way through, except for maybe to save the life of the mother. Okay. And I think that's what we would hope for policy-wise, is some sort of ban in each state that would really restrict abortion, except in a situation to protect the life of the mother, right?
Yeah.
There are situations where maybe an ectopic pregnancy, for example, those are very complex, but we would like to see our states that ban most or almost all abortion procedures except to save the life of the mother.
The other two that I hear get mentioned a lot as well is incest and potential birth defects. As a believer, where do you fall on that line?
Yeah, that's so complex.
I know it's a very small number as well. It's very low percentage.
And that's probably the first thing we need to start with is start there. You're talking about the vast majority of abortions that are taking place are taking place, basically as a form of birth control and through Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about incest or birth defects, you're talking about a smaller percentage. But this is where we've got to come back to the scriptures. We've got to come back to what God says in his word. And is a child with Down syndrome, are they made in God's image? They are. Mm-hmm. Does that child deserve to be loved? Is that child loved by their heavenly Father? Yes. And I don't see any exception in the Bible where God says, well, thou shalt not murder, but if it's someone with Down syndrome, well, then you can take that life. So I just don't, even though there are some really hard situations where women can get pregnant in a very, crisis pregnancies, that's an opportunity
Yeah.
For the church to step in
Absolutely.
and love the mother and love the child.
Yeah.
Instead of us looking at these things as, oh my gosh, this is being foisted upon us by the government. Let's say, look, the government has its role to protect human life. And then as believers, are we looking to step in to these situations and love women and children who are in these crisis pregnancies?
Yeah.
That's what a culture of life does.
Absolutely. Well, and the harder one is obviously if the mother's life is in danger. And you've already said, there probably should be some leeway there. But for you personally, where do you think as believers we fall on that line? Let's say a Christian family at the church where they're pregnant and it's either the mother or the child. How do we approach that? Or how would you approach that?
Yeah, I actually had this conversation recently with someone in our congregation.
Okay.
We were talking about ectopic pregnancies, I think, come up often, where the fertilized egg, instead of implanting in the womb, implants in the fallopian tubes. And that, as you can imagine, won't work out because the fallopian tubes are very thin. If the child starts to grow, it'll rupture the fallopian tubes and kill the mother. So I think what we would do in that situation that you would want to have, I think the biblical worldview would be, can the woman and her husband have really close conversations with their doctor to say, what can we do in this situation? As soon as we find out we've got this ectopic pregnancy, is there a way to get this fertilized egg? Could we do surgery and maybe attach it in the womb? Could we save it? And so the goal again is to save a life.
Absolutely.
But if the fertilized egg will not attach in the womb, then we say, God, we tried. We tried our hardest.
Yeah.
Our intent was not to terminate life. It was to save the life of this child, well, although at a very small point of development, but it's still a child, and then the life of the mom. But if you leave the ectopic pregnancy in the fallopian tubes, my understanding, again, I'm not a doctor, but is that it would probably kill the mom. And when the certainty of death for the mom is that high, then we have to, if we're pro-life, we've got to be concerned with the mom's life as well, right?
Absolutely. So how do you think, obviously we're in Virginia, do you think Virginia is going to end up is going to ban abortions? Where do you think Virginia falls on that line?
So that's a really good question. Right now, my understanding from just my looking at the General Assembly is that folks who would be more pro-life have the edge in the House of Delegates. It's the Senate where right now you frankly have more Democrats, and they're not. My understanding is that the Republicans have wanted to get some pro-life legislation onto Youngkin's desk, but they can't get it through the Senate. The Senate right now, there's a majority. It's a slim majority. I think it's by 1 or 2 members. The Democrats have a majority, and so they're not allowing really a lot of abortion regulations to come out of Richmond. But we have an election coming up.
Yes,
we have an election coming up, and this is where, for the first time, all of our listeners, they're going to have a chance to vote in a way that's going to be immediately tangible in Richmond. If we can vote and get a majority of folks who would support pro-life legislation, Youngkin will sign it. I think right now he's saying a 15-week ban because he thinks politically that might be all he can get. But I mean, think about that. 15 weeks, 40 weeks gestation. We're talking about that's a child that's gone through some real development. We want to see that ban get down, as low, as small as possible, like
Absolutely,
I was saying before. So I think Youngkin is going to read the tea leaves after the election, and I think he's going to see, okay, who do we have in the legislature? And if he's got enough folks that are pro-life, I think he's going to try to push through whatever he can to get voted through, and whatever he can politically get through the legislature, I think he'll sign. So if you're really pro-life and you're hoping for an absolute ban on abortions except to save the life of the mother in Virginia, that's probably politically a high, pretty difficult to hit. But if you're hoping that we could get some pro-life legislation that would restrict abortion in Virginia, get in your car and vote in the upcoming election. I think you could see a more pro-life Virginia in November.
What do you think the climate is going to look like coming out of this? Because obviously we saw some, social media, when things happen, people get up in arms, and you see some people on each end that are upset, and things have been flying around like crazy. But what do you think the climate's going to look like dust settles in a couple years when it comes to this issue?
Knives are already out, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
Look at what's going on in the media. I mean, you already have people that are protesting at justices, at the majority justices who wrote the Dobbs opinion. They're protesting at their houses. Somebody apparently admitted that they were trying to kill Justice Kavanaugh and went to his house to kill him. Justices have been, shouted and yelled out of restaurants up in the D.C., Northern Virginia area. So it's already back in the political, arena. Mm-hmm. Not only this, I'll throw something else out along these lines. You're also going to see this go through the judiciary in some states. In some states, you're going to see, just watch the abortion lobbies, and folks, they are doing everything they can to keep abortion legal state by state. So they're going to lobby their state legislators to try to get laws put into place that protect abortion as much throughout the gestation of the child. And then you're also going to see people file lawsuits in states so that the state Supreme Court could potentially issue a ruling that says, oh, well, maybe there's not a federal right to abortion, but in this state, there's a constitutional right to abortion. So that's what's going to happen. This is going to move to the state legislatures, but also you're going to see litigation as well. And we already see that. In Louisiana, that trigger law I mentioned, already abortion advocates have sued and gotten an injunction. That's where a court orders the state not to enforce a law. And that trigger law has not gone into effect yet because a state judge put an injunction on that. Okay. That was appealed, and the state Supreme Court said, no, we're going to allow the law to be enforced. But then another judge in Louisiana just said, no, well, let's hold on. We got to pause this again. I mean, it's the wild, wild west now.
So the work's far from over is what you're telling me.
Yes, that is exactly right. In fact, Matt, if there's anything our listeners can come away from today after the Dobbs decision, is that this is a time for hope. It's a time to rejoice, but this is also a time for reflection. And it is a time where the church needs to get to work. Okay? The court put this issue back into the hands of the states politically, but frankly, this has always been a church issue. I mean, you've heard the stories before in Rome. People, when they didn't have the technology for abortions, women would deliver children and then put them out in the woods for the animals to deal with them. And it was the church that would go out in the woods and pick up these newborn children and care for them. Yeah. So the real question we need to be asking ourselves as Christians, as the church, is our pro-life commitment just a bumper sticker on our car? Or are we actually willing to go do the hard work to love moms and to love babies? Yeah. Are we going to donate our time and our finances to local crisis pregnancy centers? Mm-hmm. Like the Blue Ridge Pregnancy Center or the Bedford Pregnancy Center. Are we going to reach out and help them? Are we going to donate diapers and food? Are we going to do baby showers for women who have chosen life? Yeah. Are some of us going to consider adoption? Are some of us going to consider doing foster care? Are we going to pray for our civil leaders, for Youngkin and the legislature and for the justices of the Virginia Supreme Court, that they would make smart decisions here in Virginia and then whatever state you're in this country or around the world? Are we going to do those things? Or are we just going to go, yay, Roe is gone, and then go back to living our lives?
We have jobs to do.
We have
got a lot
jobs
of work ahead of us.
We've got jobs to do.
Absolutely. It's hard not to get tangled in the weeds of the political back and forth, and obviously sometimes we want to fight that and we want to buck up against that. But obviously recently we watched the Blue Ridge Pregnancy Center get vandalized after the ruling came down. What's the best way for believers to combat those who obviously don't have the biblical worldview? They're all about, this is a choice, this is my right, and they're trying to take that out of God's hands. How do we best approach that in our conversations with those who maybe they're not throwing bricks through buildings and maybe they're not rioting or trying to kill Kavanaugh? Maybe they deeply feel, I don't believe this. The nicest people in the world who want to, have those conversations with them. What's the best way to do that?
I've thought about that in my own personal life. I think one of the first things we have to realize here is our hope is not in the government. Mm-hmm. Our hope is in Jesus Christ, and our hope is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So probably one of the most pro-life things you can do is share the gospel with your neighbors. Win them to Christ. Okay, because a culture that loves Christ is going to be a culture that loves babies. And a culture that loves and respects women, and a culture that loves and respects the institution of marriage, right? That would be the first thing you could do. But beyond that, First Peter talks about folks who ask us the reason for the hope that is within us, and the Bible talks about being prepared to give a defense, but with meekness and fear, or some versions say humility and respect.
Yeah.
This is something that it is very easy to jump into this fray with your fist held high and saying, you need to do this. It's very easy to talk, in a way that sounds very angry, talk in a way that sounds very demeaning, particularly to maybe women who find themselves in an unplanned pregnancy. But this is where we differentiate ourselves, not only in the goal of defending life, but the mode of how we do it. Yeah. So are we loving our neighbors? Are we representing Christ well as we're interacting with our neighbors, whether that's in your neighborhood, whether you're a college student and this is in a college classroom, whether you're a law student. I remember being in law school and we had to cover Roe v. Wade. Yeah. This issue came up, and I remember being one of the few pro-life people, but engaging in some great conversations with friends of mine who had a different political view on this issue. So being prepared is the first thing. I do think reading about some of your favorite apologists on about just the defending the Bible in general, but also defending life. Just these questions. I mean, you hear people sometimes talk about, I think we should pick a middle point. So, abortion should be illegal. I mean, this is what the court had before Roe, was essentially this viability line.
Yeah.
People need to know why that's arbitrary.
Right.
Why is viability a line? Is the child any less a human being 24 hours before viability? Yeah. Well, no. Well, then can we ban abortion then? Well, how about 24 hours before that? How about 24 hours? And the court in the Dobbs decision basically said, viability is a completely arbitrary line. We either gotta protect the baby fully in the womb or give it no protections whatsoever, under constitutional law. And the court just said this viability line is arbitrary. It leads to arbitrary results. The Constitution does not speak about abortion directly. So that means it's left to the states. And in those conversations, as we look to win our neighbors and our friends to a pro-life position, a life that respects what God says about the sacredness of human life from cradle to the grave. Okay, this is not just babies. This is at every stage in between your first and last breath. We need to be prepared to talk about these issues, and second of all, we need to do it with meekness and fear, with humility and respect.
That's a really good way to put that. That definitely is going to be how I try to approach it. Now, I want to get you out of here the way I do everybody, which is I always ask the same question to everybody when they walk out at the door, and that is, if you could see one biblical event live with your own eyes, without suffering the consequences of said event, what event would you want to see?
I am going to tweak your question and answer a slightly different question that I want to answer before I answer your question.
Yeah.
I was not certain I would ever live to see the day of Roe versus Wade being overturned.
Yeah.
I mean, this is monumental. Yeah. This is like when you read in your history books about Brown versus Board of Education and you go, finally, racism in the public schools, the laws that sustain that have been struck down.
Yeah.
Or the 13th Amendment, slavery is done. I mean, the Supreme Court just threw out the decision that has led to the termination of over 63 million children has just been tossed.
Yeah.
And we as the people now have the right through our elected representatives to have a say in this crucial life issue again. It blows my mind. I didn't think I would ever live in a post-Roe America, and I'm living it right now.
Yeah.
So that would be one of the first things I would say is just, I can't believe I'm seeing this.
It is an incredible thing. I didn't think I'd see it either.
It's unbelievable. But back to your specific question, and I hope this just isn't like...
There's no wrong answers.
Cheating or whatever.
Some might be better than others, but none are wrong.
The second coming.
So you're going to go future.
I'd love to be alive when the trumpet sounds.
Yeah. Well, you got a chance at that
Christ
too.
comes back. Yeah. And I'd love for that to happen in our lifetime.
Do you think there's a chance we might get that one?
I don't know. When the Father says that when Jesus says, not even I know the date of the time.
It was a trick question.
I'm not gonna say,
question.
well, I know when it's coming. So
I'm with you. I would love to see that. That would be really cool. But we did see Roe v. Wade get overturned. Maybe we'll see that one as well.
Amen.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on and explaining this. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we will take those steps and be the body that goes out and does the work that you're talking about. And we're so thankful for that charge, and hopefully we'll hear from you very soon.
Thanks so much, man. It was a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right. God bless.
We want to thank Joe for his incredible insight and wisdom. May we be praying for our country and for our church family as we reach out to those around us and navigate these tough issues. We are also navigating through the Book of Lamentations in our sermon series, Good Grief. You can catch up on all the sermons here or on our website or YouTube channel. We will see you next time, and God bless.